The set and setting were like pretty prime for something to happen. And that one, the only thing I remember when that one was I laid back and I remember that when I closed my eyes, I was projected outside the universe. And the universe was just like this green glowing ball in the middle of infinite nothingness. I didn't have a happy childhood. My father didn't really care a lot for me, and we were at odds a lot. I was kind of probably a problem child as far as he and my mother were concerned, a bit rebellious. And then when I got to be a little bit older, I got interested in chemistry and science, and my parents gave me a chemistry set for Christmas one year. And that was kind of interesting, but also boring because none of the experiments were really very exciting. So I started getting interested in pyrotechnics, explosives and fireworks, etc. And there was a drugstore down in Covington. I used to go down to the YMCA and swim on Saturday mornings in swimming class. And just down at the end of the block, there was a Rexall drugstore. And back in those days, they had powdered charcoal, saltpeter, sulfur, all the things you need to make gunpowder. So I tried to make gunpowder. I could never get it to blow up. It would always burn and make lots of colors, but I couldn't get it to explode. I didn't learn how to make it explode for many years after that. But I found out all the minerals you could put in strontium when it would burn, would make red flames, and put in copper salts or barium salts, so it would make blue and green flames. And so I was doing that, and then I discovered how to make things really explode, which was the kind of flash cracker powder they have in cherry bombs, which is powdered aluminum, potassium chlorate, and sulfur. And that would always explode. So I filled lots of containers with that gunpowder and blew them up. Probably was lucky I didn't kill somebody at some one point in my life. But anyway, doing these kind of antisocial things, somehow I think someone said, well, how did that transfer to psychedelics? I said, well, maybe psychedelics are sort of mental pyrotechnics. So maybe that was a connection with my interest in chemistry and explosives and going into pyrotechnics. But I had a big lab in my house. The upstairs of the house had been built to be rented as an apartment after the children all moved away. But when they had 4 children, we all moved upstairs and took over. And the kitchen was my bedroom. And so I had a set of bookshelves that separated where I slept from the kitchen, and I had gas and distilled water and had collected quite a few chemicals. And one of the scout leaders that we had worked at Gibson Wine Company and gave me a lot of old glassware. And then I started buying laboratory. People would advertise home labs in the newspaper. I'd read the Sunday paper and they'd say home laboratory for sale and for $50 or whatever. So I bought a couple of old labs. So I had quite an extensive lab at one point where I could do lots of things. So I graduated from high school in 1962, and the people that I hung around with, who were probably as much sociopaths as I was, Tony and Joe and Tom, they went to University of Kentucky, which was about a 1-hour drive from where I lived in northern Kentucky. And they came back and they said, hey, everybody's smoking marijuana. And I was kind of shocked by that, because I thought this was a dangerous drug. And I bought some old books, used books on pharmacology, Solman's Manual of Pharmacology, and I started reading about marijuana and things like that. I thought, well, these don't sound very bad. I mean, if this is the real stuff. So then I tried smoking some marijuana, and that I found that to be quite enjoyable. They would drink beer. I didn't care for alcohol. I never had a taste for alcohol, but marijuana was pleasant. I'd get relaxed, and we'd listen to Jimi Hendrix records and things like that. It was kind of cool. And then they said there was something called acid going around, and I started reading about LSD. There wasn't much in the literature. 1962, 1963, 1964, not much was known. But then they said that some government organization, I don't know if it was the DAA or the Bureau of Narcotics, but they were investigating because they claimed there was a bunch of acid being pushed around in the campus. And I didn't know much about it, but then I read and I saw, well, mescaline and peyote were also in this category. And so they asked me, one of my friends said, could you make LSD? And I looked at the formula and I thought, probably not, because the starting material, you could buy the starting material, from a chemical catalog firm. It was $19 for a tenth of a gram. But I couldn't work with tenth of a gram. I was still at the stage of chemistry where I'd had to make 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 grams. And so working in those amounts kind of scared me off. But then I read about mescaline, and I thought, well, that's a little bit easier to work with. And you could buy the starting material. It was $28. I remember $28 for 100 grams, I think, from a place called K&K. It was trimethoxybenzaldehyde. And I didn't have a formula for making it, but I had a set of chemistry books that told how to make a nitrostyrene using just benzaldehyde. So I thought, well, I can use trimethoxybenzaldehyde, do the same thing. And it actually worked really well. And I got these copious amounts of these beautiful lemon yellow crystals, which was the intermediate for mescaline. I was in engineering for 2 years, and there was just too much math for me, and I dropped out, started working as a technician in industry in Cincinnati area, and was going to night school to get my bachelor's degree, working toward a BS. And there was another student there who was in the organic class with me, Larry, and he was interested in all kinds of crazy things. And I said, hey, Larry, I'm trying to make some mescaline, and I need to do a reduction with something called lithium aluminum hydride. And he didn't know anything about it. I explained to him what it was, and you could buy it, and it was a gray powder, pretty pyrophoric though. You have to be careful not to start a fire. And I'm kind of afraid to do it in my home lab because I might start a big fire and burn the house down. And he said, well, I'll do it. I've got a lab in his parents' house in the basement. And so he took it, and I gave him all the nitrostyrene intermediate. And he made a couple attempts and failed every time. And then the last one, he says, well, I got one more batch I'm going to try. And that one he called me up and said, I got 7 grams of mescaline sulfate. That's really cool. So the dose was about 250 milligrams. So I got a bunch of gelatin capsules from a friend of mine who was working in a generic drug warehouse and filled 28 of them with 1/4 of a gram of mescaline sulfate. And the guy who'd asked me to do it came up, Joe, and said, yeah, how much do you want for it? I said, well, the starting material cost me $28. I got 28 capsules, $1 a capsule, $28. That would take care of it. You don't want it, that's all you want? I said, yeah, okay. So I sold him these 28 capsules of mescaline sulfate for $28. And then he said, well, don't you want one of these? And I said, well, I don't know. Oh yeah, you got to take one. So he gave me one of them. They came up a week or two later, Joe and Tom and Tony, and they said, let's take the mescaline and go someplace. And Tom was going to drive us because we couldn't drive. So I took one of those capsules, that capsule of mescaline, and they took us over to a little bar in downtown Cincinnati in the African-American section of town close to the river. We went in this little bar, and I was pretty buzzed by then. And we went in, it was all full of black people. Here's these 4 white boys coming into this place in the low-income part of Cincinnati. But I didn't feel bad at all. I just was really enjoying it. We sat at a table in the back, and they were playing jazz, which is a music that I don't care for, but I liked it that night quite a lot. It was really good. We were listening to it, and then the band took a break and went out. And Tom, the guy who was our sort of sitter, went outside. And then he came back in and sat down at the table with us. And the band came in and said, this next tune is dedicated to the boys in the back, and pointed to us. And everybody turned around. I remember there were some black people there that had gold teeth, and I was high as a kite on this mescaline. And they're all smiling at us like, what kind of thumbs up. We spent most of the night there, and then he drove me home. And I remember driving down through the streets of Cincinnati at probably 1 or 2 in the morning with these mercury vapor lights that were kind of a blue-green cast. And I can remember thinking I couldn't tell if my eyes were open or closed. Because if they were closed, you could tell, the light was going by, but you'd imagine, hallucinate the lights going by. Went home and laid down in bed and fell asleep, and that was like my first experience with a psychedelic. I wouldn't say it was profound, but it was very enjoyable. The music was just really wonderful. I just really had a good time that night. So that was my first experience. And I didn't take a lot of psychedelics, but then probably the most memorable one after that was Tony had gotten some, after he dropped out of UK and moved back into northern Kentucky. And he had gotten some LSD tablets, purple flats, I think they were. And he said, you want to try one? And he said, it's a lot like mescaline. So I said, sure. And went to his apartment, and he had put green light bulbs in all the sockets and closed the windows and was burning incense and playing Ravi Shankar music. So the set and setting were like pretty prime for something happened. And that one, the only thing I remember when that one was I laid back and I remember that when I closed my eyes, I was projected outside the universe. And the universe was just like this green glowing ball in the middle of infinite nothingness. I can say those words, but they don't mean now what they did then. It was a ball, the universe was in the middle of infinite nothingness. And it was glowing, and it had this kind of hum about it. And I recognized this hum was the life, that the purpose of the universe was to serve as a forum, as a womb for life. The function of the universe was to serve as a womb for life. And at that point, it impressed me that the universe must be full of life. And that was very impressive. And there were some other things, like looking at your face in the mirror when you're taking LSD. I looked like I was an old monk that had been killed and died. Weird ideas would come into your head. But it was very, very kind of impressive, things that you just wouldn't happen normally, obviously. So I don't have a lot of memories of those. I didn't do a lot of drugs because I had to be a serious student and had a job in the daytime. But I did have one later on where once I was at Purdue and was doing this research, I took a molecule that was related to psilocybin called CZ74. Was a compound that Sandoz had made. And I remember thinking about my father, who I had this strained relationship with. I remember thinking that if he could take this, it would change his life. That his problem was he had never learned how to share. And I had never really thought about that before. But then I had this real sadness. Tears just started flowing in my eyes. I felt so sad that he had never learned how to share. He couldn't share himself because he had never learned how to share. So that was another one of those events that happens where you take a psychedelic and you have a perception that you hadn't had before. But I still have elements of my father in me that I see that I don't like. But I'm very different from him. And I'm consciously different because I wanted to be different. And I wanted to be different partly because I took psychedelics and I could see the bad things and the things that I needed to change. I couldn't see them. You're raised that way. You don't question. A lot of people don't question their background. I mean, we could probably go out on the street and find a dozen guys that came out of their father was some farmer, plumber, whatever, and they're just like him. And they're misogynistic and they never self-reflect. And if you don't ever self-reflect, and you're not willing to see, like, what is it about me that other people don't like, that I should change? I mean, some people just say, I'm who I am, that's it. Mostly, those kinds of things got me really interested in studying these because they were so powerful and had such memorable, effects in my mind. So when I was going to go to graduate school, I tried to find a place that was doing research on psychedelics. There wasn't any place. The University of Iowa had the chairman of the division there, Joe Cannon. He's passed away now, but he was working on atropine analogs. And atropine is a real disruptor. It's really a psychotomimetic. It's not really psychedelic. But that was as close as I could get. And I thought, well, these are atropine and those analogs affect your mind and your brain and can produce real hallucinations. I had never taken anything like that, but I thought, yeah, that's as close as I could get. So then I had applied to Indiana University in the chemistry department and Ohio State University in chemistry, and then medicinal chemistry at Iowa. And I got accepted at Iowa and at Ohio State. And the place I was working at that time, my boss said, well, you have to go to Ohio State. Nobody's ever heard of Iowa, but Ohio State's this big organic chemistry powerhouse. But I was really interested more in medicinal chemistry rather than just straight organic chemistry. So I ended up accepting the offer from Iowa. And then he came in one day and said, so when do you start at Ohio State? And I said, well, I'm not going to go to Ohio State. What? No, I'm going to go to Iowa. Oh, that's a terrible mistake. No, can you write and tell them you made a mistake? Write to Ohio State and say, you made a mistake, you're going to go there. But I didn't want to do that. So I got to Iowa, and Joe Cannon, when I met with him, didn't offer me a project like that. He offered me a project working on what were called apomorphine derivatives. Apomorphine, if you take morphine, which is a painkiller, and if you boil it up in hydrochloric acid, it goes through a bunch of chemical transformations and you end up with a compound called apomorphine. Apomorphine's most noble effect is if somebody gives it to you, you'll vomit violently. So he said, I think I'm going to offer you, I want you to work on this project with apomorphine. The problem with apomorphine was I wasn't interested in drugs that made people vomit. So that was kind of a far cry. In addition, all the literature on these compounds had been published in German. And I had to take reading German for my bachelor's degree in chemistry, but I didn't have a facility for languages, and German was difficult for me. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to spend several years reading this German literature, which I hate, making compounds that make people vomit. And I thought, this is not really my idea of a good time. But then he said, although he had applied for a fellowship, after Sputnik went up, we had a program of National Defense Education Acts, NDEA fellowships. And they were to promote STEM careers. And medicinal chemistry was STEM, science, technology, engineering, etc., math. So he had applied for it, and I'd received one of these NDEA Title IV fellowships. So I had 3 years of a fellowship. So he said, now, even though we've corresponded and I've written to you, you can work for anybody you want to in the division. So there was a fellow there that was analyzing DDT residues in foodstuffs, and that wasn't interesting to me. And there was another professor who was working on oral contraceptives from natural products. He had a couple of students. Basically, those are my choices. So I went in to talk to this fellow who was had students making oral contraceptives, and his name was Charles Barfnecht. And he said, and I've got a third student. So he had one student, Tim, was making anti-inflammatory agents, and this other student was a Chinese student who was extracting presumably oral contraceptives, and the third student was working on mescaline metabolites. And that perked me up. Mescaline metabolites, because I'd been reading whatever literature I could. And Alexander Shogun had published a paper in the spring of 1969 where he'd summarized structure-activity relationships of one-ring psychotomimetics, they were called. And I had read that paper, and I knew chapter and verse in there. So when he said he had this student that was making mescaline metabolites, I said, well, what's he doing? What's his chemistry? So he said, well, mescaline, he's making things that are potentially, the body could be converting mescaline into these things as metabolic products. And he said, he gave me an example of the chemistry he'd done. He had done this reaction where he had taken what's called a ketone, had treated it with lithium aluminum hydride, and he'd done a big reduction on it. And he'd done it in ether. And what I didn't know was this student who had made this reduction had done a huge reaction. He had a big flask with 2 liters of anhydrous diethyl ether in it, and had multiple grams of lithium aluminum hydride. And lithium aluminum hydride is flammable. And he'd had it in a big flask, and it had boiled up, and he had a mechanical stirrer with a motor on it that generated sparks. And the fumes had gone out, and the sparks had lit a fire, and the whole reaction had gone up in flames. The department had passed this regulation that nobody could do a reduction with lithium aluminum hydride on that scale. When he's telling me he did this reduction, I said, why did he use lithium aluminum hydride? And he said, well, what would you use? I said, well, sodium borohydride would do this. You could do it in ethyl alcohol. It wouldn't be flammable. It would be very completely safe and all. Really? And he's taking notes down. So I had discovered, the student had outed the student because he wasn't aware of this reagent, lithium aluminum hydride, which I knew about. So he got excited because I had this NDA fellowship. So he said, well, you could work for me if you wanted to. Yeah. Because it would pay my tuition, it would pay expenses for my research, and it gave him a stipend for research as well. So it was a good deal for him for 3 years. So he just turned me loose in the lab. Now, because I'd been working as a technician in industry for 5.5 years while I got my bachelor's degree, I knew how to do chemistry. Most of the graduate students who came in, this was prior to the era where nowadays undergraduates will often do research projects. There weren't many undergraduate research projects in that era, 1969 or so. So I had much more experience in laboratory work than a typical graduate student. So I came in and I was just right up front. I was running 3 or 4 reactions at the same time. I had separate notebooks for each one. It was very productive, and plus I had been writing research reports for the company that I worked for. So I could type. My mother had forced me to take typing in high school, which I was pissed at the time. She said, you'll never be sorry you took typing. There were 2 boys in my typing class and 28 girls. And I felt really embarrassed to be in there. But it saved my career because I could type 60, 70 words a minute, and I can still type, touch type. So I was typing things out, and I would go in and say, I had an idea for a paper, and I'd type out an introduction. What do you think about that? Oh, that sounds good, go ahead. So he basically was my cheerleader for most of the time. I would just go in and he'd say, what are you working on now? What do you think's next? So he basically turned me loose, which was to his credit, because I probably would have been really bucked if he'd put reins on me and told me, this is what I want you to do, because I just got in there and did what I did. I published, I think, 14 papers as a graduate student, which is kind of unusual. They weren't long papers, but I was just having a lot of fun. The Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970, and I was in the first year of my graduate work. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to work on these when I get out of here, but at least I'm going to have fun as a graduate student. And so I had really a lot of fun. I finished up probably in record time. I was finished by the summer of 1972. And he came in, and I didn't realize my NDA fellowship had run out in 3 years. And so he's thinking, okay, I need to find money to support Dave. And he came in the summer of 72 and said, you need to write up your thesis. Well, I had only been there less than 3 years. And I thought, but he thought I wanted to get out quickly, and start making money because I had a family, and my oldest son had been born in '67. And so I begged him to let me stay, because there was one compound I wanted to make, which was a hybrid of LSD and mescaline that I dreamed up. I never did it, never was able to make it, but that was what I wanted to work on, and I felt I could make it. I was real close. So he said, okay, well, you can stay on into next semester. And then what they did, my fellowship ran out, so they put me in charge of, they had bought a new little, an NMR machine. And they had put the NMR machine there. It was not real big, but they needed an operator to be trained on it and help run Spectra for people. So I made sheets for submitting samples and would run samples for people. Did that for that semester. And then he came in about mid-semester and said, you need to write your thesis up. And I said, well, give me a couple more weeks. All right, but you got to write your thesis up. So anyway, I couldn't get the compound made, so I wrote my thesis up and defended it in January of '73. In the meantime, I'd been kind of a pharmacology groupie, because when I'd have reactions going in the lab, I'd go over to the pharmacology department, which is the medical school right next to the pharmacy building. J.P. Long had a long-standing collaboration with Joe Cannon. And so I was making all these psychedelic amphetamines and taking them over. And J.P. Long had a postdoctoral fellow named H.C. Chang. We called him Charlie Chang. And he wanted a project, so he was testing them out in these smooth muscle preparations, taking dog veins and putting them in, see if they contracted and so forth. So I was going over and saying, how does this work? And learning pharmacology. I had to take a pharmacology course for my med chem PhD anyway, but I was over there actually kind of a pharmacology groupie, I guess, and learning how to do it. So when I was getting close to being finished, I went over, and J.P. Long had a graduate student. We called him Jumbo Jim, I think. And he was doing some mouse studies for a master's degree, but he'd been accepted to medical school in the fall. And he needed one more compound that he hadn't been able to get to complete his master's thesis. It turned out this compound was one that had been made by this guy who had used the lithium aluminum hydride reaction that caused a big fire. And he hadn't been able to make this compound. So I said, can you test some on my compounds? And he said, I'll test them for you, but I need this compound. If you can make this compound, then I'll do it. So I went back over, and I made a big bottle of this stuff. Chris got big crystals. It was probably 10 grams or 15 grams. The crystals are so big they look like rock candy, if you've seen that before. When I was finishing up my PhD work, I walked over in pharmacology, and I ran it, and back in those days, they didn't have word processors. They had these rub-on letters. And I'd made a label for it, and I'd put the structure on it, and I had put the name of the chemical company was the Sheer Grace of God Chemical Company, because he hadn't been able to get it, and I thought this is kind of a joke, and 10 grams, whatever. So I was walking over to the pharmacology department to give this to Jim so he could run it in his mice, and I ran into J.P. Long, and I said, I think Jim's waiting for this. He looked at it, and he saw that Sheer Grace of God Chemical Company. He broke out in a big laugh. I says, I'm thinking about maybe a postdoc in pharmacology. You think there would be a place for me? He says, I think we can find a place for you. So I just moved transparently over from pharmacy into medicinal chemistry, or to pharmacology, and just worked over there. And so I wrote a couple programs for analyzing dose response data. They were using, back in those days, punch cards. And you'd have to punch a whole deck of cards and take them over to the computer center, and they'd load them in, and then when your job was done, they'd send it back. And they had just gotten Hewlett-Packard, I think it was a 9810 programmable calculator. And so I wrote a bunch of programs to do dose response curves and do plots. It had a big flatbed plotter. I did that, and I did some cat experiments and some mouse experiments, and basically took a course in biostatistics. And so sort of became kind of a functioning pharmacologist, which turned out to be very useful, because when I started at Purdue in '74, I wanted to keep working on psychedelics, and so there was no way doing that work. So I had to do the chemistry and the pharmacology myself. So I basically did both chemistry and pharmacology in the early years. Made the MDMA for MAPS, made the DMT for Strassman, made the psilocybin for Johns Hopkins, and really was promoting this as much as I could, because I really thought, based on just my experiences, but other people I talked to had even more powerful experiences. The thing that really hammered me the most was I was at a meeting in Esalen, and somebody had brought 5-methoxy-DMT.
Thank you for watching, and please remember to like this video and to subscribe to our channel.
For more information or to make a donation towards our cause, please visit our website.